So what do the Irish do for an encore? Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we all love each and every day. Best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry right here. So please lock it in with a like. Comment below on your thoughts on Notre Dame and the ACC. Of course, subscribe. Hit that bell for the notifications. That way you know when we're going live. And it wouldn't hurt for you to join us on Patreon and catch up with those predictions. 16-4 against the spread this past weekend. 16-4 against the spread. Okay, Ben Belden, we've got on the line, covers Notre Dame football, number of podcasts and platforms throughout the years. Catch him on social media. We will post his Twitter handle in just a second. Ben, how you doing today?
Doing well. Always good to come on the show and, talk football, especially after a big win of the magnitude of Saturday night.
So how long has it been since there was a big win of that kind of magnitude? I know I've got a year and a team in my mind, but I'll hear from you.
Well, I think the biggest one was 1993 Florida State. So that's about 27 years since they beat number one. Certainly they've had some other marquee wins since then, but that one, like I say, that was the last time that they beat the number one seed like they had. So the number one overall ranking, not number one seed. I guess I'm in basketball mode, but I think I think we understand. So.
Absolutely. And so there's a few different ways to look at monumental wins. One would be in the moment. You could be the worst team in the country, and if you beat number one, you beat number one. You beat number one. There you go. Okay, and then there's putting into the context of what did this parlay the rest of this season into? Did this become just, okay, that was the highlight of the season or the decade, beating that kind of team, but we went 8-4? Or did this springboard us toward a championship, and did it become a monumental win as a breakthrough? That has yet to be seen. This is a program that's obviously notched 10 or 11 wins for a number of consecutive years under Brian Kelly and is looking for that next step, and they took it on Saturday night. Well, whether they can sustain it, we shall see probably in a few weeks in Charlotte. So there's been some speculation. You mentioned it to me before we started to record. I'd actually Googled Notre Dame just to catch up with anything that was out there, ran across the same narrative. The recruiting impact of a win like Clemson. Notre Dame has had little issue competing in the recruiting wars over the last several years anyway. There's certainly been some substantial upgrades, but doesn't hurt when you can say, okay, we finally did it in that kind of game. Did you see how we played and won the game over what's considered the gold standard in college football?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't go out and say that there's going to be a whole lot of flips in terms of, I saw somebody on social media speculating that Will Shipley, who is, one of the top running backs in the country, recently committed to Clemson, and it was down to Notre Dame and Clemson. I'm not going to go out and say that type of flip is going to happen. However, and I also don't know that it's necessarily a 2021 real game changer. I think in future classes with, high school kids who are juniors right now, who have maybe a little bit less of an idea of where they're headed after graduation, that's where you could really start to see some of that change in terms of, Notre Dame could really pick up some momentum, at least when you compare them to, the Clemsons, the Ohio States, the Alabamas of the world. So that's potentially where you'll see it right now. I don't know that I'm not a recruiting insider by any means, but I'm not even sure that the insiders necessarily know of specific names that Notre Dame could now land. But, the general buzz has been that, some guys that were maybe not quite so up on Notre Dame, or at least had only showed vague interest now, are already calling to set up official visits and that type of thing.
Ben, is there anything you saw out of Ian Book on Saturday night that you hadn't seen before? Is that the best that he's played?
I can't think of a time, honestly. Right. Yeah. I can't think of a time, honestly, that he has played that well and that consistently and that loose. That's the biggest thing for me, is that he's always, when he's struggled, he seems uncomfortable. When he's comfortable and playing football, I think Ian Book's pretty darn good. When he's second guessing himself, not so much. And I think he found the balance Saturday night. It sort of seemed like he was cautious in the right ways, and the fact that he wasn't reckless in turning it over, but also just let it fly a couple of times, and it paid off. I mean, his completion percentage wasn't tremendous. I think he was 22 of 39, if I remember correctly. And so, I mean, he's hovering in the high 50s right there, but he threw it with conviction. He took some shots, and he just seemed willing to do that all night. And I think there was a stat floating out there that he completed like 60% of his passes against the blitz, which was the biggest thing. We've seen him hold on to the ball and, get happy feet and deliver inaccurate throws and things against the blitz at different times through his Notre Dame career. He handled the pressure, and, part of it, give credit to his offensive line, give credit to Kyron Williams, the running back, for being so good in pass protection in passing situations as well. So, yeah, I think that's about as good as we've seen Ian Book play. The best 4 quarters of football, at least, that he's put together in a game of that magnitude, for sure, in a Notre Dame uniform.
One of the staples for this football team over the time that Brian Kelly is upgraded, starting in 2011, 2012, obviously going to a BCS championship game, and then even beyond that, has been the offensive line. It's been the staple unit of this program. But in some of these letdown games against the big opponents, we would have to go back and break down the actual game tape to figure out, okay, where's the offensive line let them down? And we know how good the offensive line has been, and then those players march on to the NFL. So it's not like they're doing it against some kind of weak opponents or schedule. Those players are legit, but they, Miami comes to mind in 2017 where the offensive line didn't have a good game. Again, I temper the criticism in the Clemson playoff game because they didn't score. So does that go to the offensive line or the lack of explosiveness on the outside? But it seemed like this was the game that the offensive line just did everything, at such a high rate that it allowed the offense to function consistently most plays down the field.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I think when you think back to that Miami game that you referenced, I think one of the major criticisms then was that Notre Dame never threw the ball down the field. And so it seemed like in that Miami game, couldn't run the ball, couldn't hit on especially in that year, it was the short passing game for Notre Dame that was kind of their bread and butter. And if I'm not mistaken, and Brandon Wimbush started that game, and then Ian Book took over later on after it was decided. So especially with Brandon Wimbush, it was kind of the short passing game, the read option type of stuff that they were kind of relying on, and they just couldn't get anything going there. But yeah, I think this was the best complementary offensive game that Notre Dame's played. And I had said that multiple times throughout the week that you couldn't Clemson only being able to run the ball and then not being able to throw it, or vice versa. And actually, I said if Ian Book threw more than 30, 35 passes, I thought it was going to be a bad thing for Notre Dame. Now it went into overtime. That obviously kind of changed it a little bit. And, but still, though, I think they had enough opportunities on offense that they were able to run and throw with balance. And that obviously helped the offense. And, when one thing gets going, it kind of feeds into another aspect of your game. And like I say, it was just good overall complementary football. And I don't think there was anyone that didn't play well.
It's almost Christmas time, folks. Grab the link in the description section below and shop at Amazon using our link. It's the same shopping experience. You don't spend an extra penny. Same deal right there. You can see it there on the crawl below Ben's name. Also, join us on Patreon. You can grab that link in the description section as well. 15 cents a day. Predictions, insider look, betting advice. Also, watch parties and exclusive live streams with you. Talking Notre Dame football with Ben Belden. Boston College is up ahead. Speaking of 1993, I know Notre Dame fans don't want to hear more about they're good with hearing about 1993 through the Florida State game, then don't want to hear the comparisons, what happened the next week. If anybody's not following along there, as Ben cited at the outset, in 1993, Notre Dame beat Florida State, a number one team that went on to quote unquote win the national championship. I would agree with Notre Dame fans in having a dispute about that. But anyway, beat Florida State, a number one team at home. And then the next week, Boston College came to town and kicked a last second field goal to knock off the Irish, their lone loss of the season. So it is Notre Dame and Boston College. Before we get to the Eagles, Ben, you and other people had mentioned, when we've had you on during the offseason, the excitement about bringing on Kevin Austin and Braden Lenzy and seeing them add another dimension to this offense. They haven't been on the field, won't be on the field, at least Austin. And so are you at least happy and content? I guess you would have to be with the wide receiver performance, considering it doesn't necessarily or isn't supposed to have that next tier of or dimension of explosiveness, but still went out and produced a ton of points.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Notre Dame was able to rely on Saturday night was guys like Javon McKinley, who's a fifth-year senior at Notre Dame, a guy that, he had battled some injuries and he had just been a little bit buried on the depth chart. He's getting his opportunity as one of the most experienced guys in the receiving corps and came up big with, 5 catches for over 100 yards in this one. And, Ben Skoranek, graduate transfer from Northwestern, had a couple big catches. And then Avery Davis, who is a guy that Notre Dame fans have come to love because he's played about every position, every skill position on both sides of the football, it seems like. Was recruited to Notre Dame as kind of like a dual threat quarterback. He's played running back. He played a little bit of defensive back last year, has played slot receiver, so on and so forth. He came up with, a couple big catches. Most notably, on that last drive of regulation, he came up with a big one down the middle to put Notre Dame in the red zone and eventually tie the score there. So, it's not the guys necessarily that I think a lot of Notre Dame fans thought would be catching the ball. Braden Lenzy had kind of been at different points last year used in like a jet sweep type of a situation. At different times this year, they've used running back Chris Tyree, who's a freshman who has similar type of speed and that type of thing. So they're filling in the gaps. They're getting more out of the tight end position this year with true freshman Michael Mayer, who made a couple big plays and missed a couple big plays, frankly, against Clemson. But so they're filling in different ways. It's just, I think the passing game's coming along. It just took a while to sort of get some of those guys indoctrinated a little bit because it wasn't, the guys that are catching the passes are not necessarily the guys that you thought would be the major components of Notre Dame's offense when you were taking a look at this team in the in the preseason.
The offense looked better in recent weeks, but was obviously uneven against Duke and Louisville in particular. The defense has been consistent throughout. So giving up 40 points, are you giving that more to Clemson's speed and ability and quarterback play? As any defense is going to give up that type of point and yardage totals to that type of talent, or did you see anything you didn't necessarily like?
I'll say this, that under Clark Lee, it's been pretty obvious, I think, that Notre Dame's defense generally picks something they want to take away, and they game plan around taking that away. I mean, I think my favorite example of this is when Notre Dame played USC last season in South Bend. They basically played 3 deep safeties the whole time to make USC have to nickel and dime them down the field. And it resulted in quite a few yards, but they held USC's offense in check and didn't let like Amon-Ra St. Brown and those type of guys from USC get going. They had a nominal type of game plan against Clemson in the fact that they certainly weren't playing 3 deep safeties, but they clearly wanted to take Travis Etienne away and were going to give up, conceded that they were going to give up some yards in the passing game. And obviously they did that. I mean, DJ threw for, I'm not even going to try his last name, on this because I'll just make a fool of myself, but threw for more yards than any quarterback has ever thrown for against Notre Dame, which it seems a little surprising, but I mean, given the new era of college football, I guess it's maybe not all that surprising. But, so I think they took away ETN. That was the game plan. That's what they wanted to do. They knew they were going to try to get ETN involved in the running game and in the passing game, and they were able to do that. And, I know they gave up 40 points. I mean, it was 40 points 33 in regulation. And, considering they scored on defense once, they were also on the field a lot. So, and gave a good offensive team a lot of opportunities. So I don't feel any anxiety, I guess is the word, about the defense based off of their performance Saturday night. I think pretty much they were as good as they have been, and just played against a really good Clemson team with, 5-star talent across the board.
I've had these Clemson guys on for a few years now, so I've heard DJ's name for a few years back to the time that they recruited and signed him. I just always thought, I'll learn and remember how to say his name when I have to because he's not playing. So, but then all of a sudden, boom. So, Uiagalelei, I believe is the correct pronunciation. I have to think about it phonetically before I actually say it.
I just don't trust myself. That's really all
DJ.
it is. Right.
He's DJ. So we go from DJ to BC, and Boston College very capable with old friend Phil Jurkovec as the starting quarterback, and he's played very well. I saw the fourth quarter against UNC. They were a heavy underdog. It was one of those games where they got down early, and so it was kind of dismissed that they were going to lose, but then they crept back in the game, and before you know it, they're down by 8, and he leads a drive in the fourth quarter. Would have tied the game, but they needed 2-point conversion. They didn't get it. It was brought back actually the other way, but they took North Carolina to the final 45 seconds. So I saw that. I saw the Clemson game. That's always a difficult read when there's a talent discrepancy and the quarterback's kind of running for his life all the time. But he's been pretty impressive. They've got a tight end in Hunter Long, who's one of the best in the business. And Jeff Hafley has made things a bit more interesting and exciting there at Boston College, coming in from Ohio State. So certainly not an opponent, as we saw with Clemson 2 weeks ago, that can be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's Boston called 5-3 right now, I think, and playing good football, having lost, 2 of those 3 losses are to Clemson and North Carolina, who are obviously ranked fairly high in their own right. So, yeah, I think that it's going to be an interesting game. Obviously, after an emotional win of the magnitude of Clemson, you worry about the emotional letdown. But I don't think Notre Dame is going to have the letdown, especially going up against a quarterback that, if you read between the lines of some things that have been said and since while he was at Notre Dame and some things since he's left, it wasn't exactly left on great terms. And I think Notre Dame is going to take this pretty seriously, that they're, going against a familiar, I don't know if saying familiar foe makes sense, but a guy that they're familiar with. So I generally expect that, I think Phil's going to play well, and I think Notre Dame is going to play better. And I don't think this one ends up particularly close, although Boston College, like you said, has been noted to, or has played well against better opponents in very recent memory.
They always seem like that type of team generally, but especially this season, where they can go up against the likes of Texas State and they had to kick a last-second field goal to beat Texas State 24-21. The only non-competitive game was against Virginia Tech. They got their doors blown off by 26. They played a hapless Syracuse team last week. They beat them 16-13. But then they played the better teams, like, of course, Clemson being the classic example, and they take it down to the wire. They beat Pitt by a point in overtime on a missed point extra, and we talked about the North Carolina game. So I think it's an interesting challenge. Notre Dame is clearly the better team, but again, on the road and taking on a Boston College team that's certainly going to be up for the challenge. And there's some interesting storylines with Jurkovec and the history of the rivalry as well. All right, Ben, we appreciate you stopping by. I want to check out Ben's work. Just go to, there you go. Let's see, we'll find it. There we go. Real B. Belden right there on Twitter. Check out Ben's coverage of Notre Dame football. Ben, we appreciate you stopping by. I hope you enjoy the game.
Yeah, always a good time. Thanks, Mark.